Hello, everybody. Welcome back to yet another episode of Storytime with Mr. Bates. This time around, before we dive into the topic of today's video, I do want to talk to you a bit about this channel, just really briefly. My plan here is to upload 2 videos per week. Last week I uploaded one on Tuesday and the other on Thursday. I want to keep that schedule going as best I can. However, with everything that's going on, and the fact that I'm a teacher alongside my wife, who's also a teacher, and we're both having to develop lessons and continue trying to teach while we're here at home. Some days I just don't have time to work on this. I would do more, but researching topics, writing scripts, recording, editing, and all that, it takes a bit of time. So I think 2 videos per week is a pretty good goal to shoot for. Now, let's move on to today's topic. First, a special shout out to my mentor, Mrs. Zenn, over at Allen Park Middle School, for suggesting today's topic, the galley slaves. I want to remind everyone watching that slavery has unfortunately been documented all throughout human history, and it's not specific to American history before the Civil War. A lot of Americans, at least, when you mention slavery, they tend to think of slaves on plantations in the American South. That's true, but that's not the only time that we see slavery in history. In fact, galley slaves, which is the topic of today's video, were staples on ships in ancient Greece, the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, and the kingdoms of Spain and France, just to name a few cultures that had them. Galley slaves were a special kind of slave that worked in the hold of a galley and were treated pretty poorly, to put it lightly. But before we talk about them, I want to talk about the ships that they served on. So, that takes us to part 1 of today's video. What is a galley? A galley is a type of shallow ship used by Mediterranean countries like Rome, Greece, France, and Spain. The fact that it was shallow was a major benefit, as it allowed the ship to sort of cut through the water, like glide on top of it. And it made beaching really easy, so you could row the ship right up onto the beach and your soldiers could hop out and attack. Amphibious movements is what that's called. Very useful in combat. They had sails, but they were also powered by, the statistics vary, but around 150 men that would row to also further propel the ships even faster. The shallow design also came with some drawbacks, however. Since they didn't have a lot of storage space, galleys had to frequently resupply, so they couldn't sail too far away from their home countries and the shorelines there. And they were not very sea-worthy, let's say. They couldn't sail very well in open ocean. They did fine in the Mediterranean Sea and the Aegean Sea and in that area. But once you take it out into the Atlantic Ocean, you get too far out, you're liable to capsize because it's too shallow. You need a deeper boat to get into those open waters like that. Part 2. Who rowed the boats? Originally, these ships were powered in part by trained soldiers volunteering for the job. This was beneficial since if the ship got into combat, they could stop rowing and go out to fight. Over time, however, these things changed. Sources differ on whether people quit volunteering or if the need for rowers got so great that they just had no other choice but to include slaves in this combat. But eventually, we do know that there weren't enough volunteers. There is evidence to show that slaves were forced into service on some of these galleys. Rome, for example, used slaves on their boats during the Second and Third Punic Wars, but had crews made entirely of freedmen in their war against the Antiochus and the Third Macedonian War. Regardless, there are many instances where people started being conscripted into military service. Conscription, in this case, basically means being forced into slavery. In fact, to quote Carmen Terés, the director of the Navy Archives of Spain, "When the king needed rowers, he provided incentives for the courts to give out galley sentences." Now, imagine this. You're an average sailor serving your country or empire in the Navy, and you volunteer for rowing duty. You think, okay, I'll help row the ship. You show up to start your duty, you report for duty, and you find out you'll be rowing the ship with a man convicted of assault, and a prisoner captured from the country you're going to fight against. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't feel so great about doing that anymore. Obviously, this likely contributed to the decrease in rates of volunteering. And soon after that, ships would be packed with conscripted, again, basically meaning enslaved, men to row them. These slaves usually served on these ships for life, but on rare occasions could be freed if their king felt generous, their captain won a battle, or if they were traded for prisoners of war. Now, you could also return to life on land if the war you were serving in ended. You'd serve for life if your life lasted as long as the war. But if the war ended while you were serving on this ship, then you could be allowed to return to whatever it was you were doing before you were conscripted into the boat, provided you're not convicted and serving a sentence. Then you'd have to continue to serve someone for the remainder of your sentence. Or if you're a slave, you have to just find someone to serve on land, most likely the family that gave you to the military to begin with. Part 3. What was it like? Life as a galley slave was not the best. About 150 men were packed onto the boat just to row, and were usually put into the lower decks of the ship. There were some designs where they're out in the open, and the other sailors are just kind of around them. But for the most part, you've got the crew up top, the soldiers up top, and then you've got the galley slaves underneath on the lower deck. These ships sailed in the Mediterranean during the spring and summer months, which were the common months for fighting, where temperatures regularly reach between the 80s and 90s. They spend most of the day rowing in these tight confines with little chance for a breeze to help cool them off. They're just stuck in these stagnant, hot, wet boxes. Does it sound fun to you? No? Well, what if I sweeten the deal? I can tell you a bit more about their life. Maybe then you'll decide, hey, it doesn't sound so bad. Maybe you'll change your mind. They were often fed remarkably poorly, given a daily ration of stale bread, bean stew, and water, and were rarely allowed to move freely about the boat. They would not bathe regularly, though that wasn't that uncommon throughout human history. Most times you see people bathe maybe once a week, possibly up to once a month. But they were all stuck in close together with a bunch of other sweaty men who have eaten nothing but bread and beans. You all know what beans cause you to do. I don't want to even imagine the smell of these holds that these men are working in. On top of that, because they were so unclean and so close together, disease spread very quickly throughout these crews. If someone, let's say, brought on a flu with them and they didn't know they were carrying, that flu could rip through the entire crew very, very quickly. And then you've got a bunch of sick people all in close together, on top of the wretched odor. Not an ideal situation. If a galley slave started to slow down or failed to keep pace with the rest of the group, they risked being beaten by their captors. This ensured that galley slaves exerted all of their energy moving these ships about. In fact, in a few depictions, you see galley slaves that are rowing so hard that they start to pass out. That's not that uncommon, because either you row and you give it your all, or you're going to get beaten to near death. Rocking a hard place there. If one of the captives passed away while rowing, the other crewmen would simply throw them overboard and replace them next time they had a chance, usually when they would make landfall next. Finally, according to some sources, galley slaves were chained together to their benches, and if the ship went down, they went down with it. Some historians say this was likely the case to begin with, but that the practice would have been abandoned later on in many cultures, as slaves were valuable members of the crew. Think about it like this. If the slaves died in an attack because they were chained up and they couldn't defend themselves, and then the people on the boat successfully win that battle, they're able to repel the enemy, well, who's going to row the boat now? All your slaves are dead because while you were being attacked, your slaves were killed. Are you going to row it? Not a good situation for those sailors. So you can see why eventually they start to place more value on the lives of these galley slaves. So the use of chaining them to the benches would have been ended. And we have historical evidence to show that that practice sort of falls out of favor with each culture over time. Basically, to sum all of this up, galley slaves were forced into lower decks of the ship with little to no ventilation, 149 other sweaty and unwashed men, and dealt with hard labor, food that is either stale or that causes gassiness. They were beaten regularly, and they faced a bunch of diseases. What do you think? Does that sound like a good thing? I told you I was going to try to convince you. I hope now you have a better understanding of the life of a galley slave. Obviously, I'm not hoping that any of you want to be one, because that would be a real concern. Now for the question of the day. In the comments below, I want you to tell me, if you were a galley slave and your ship was attacked, would you fight for your captors and hope to be set free as a reward, or would you join the attackers and fight the people keeping you as a slave? Just like last time, I'm looking forward to reading your responses. Only a couple people responded last time. Hopefully we can get a little bit more engagement there. Let me know how you'd handle this situation in the comments down below. Have a great rest of the day and great rest of the week. I'll see you hopefully on Thursday with the next video. Have a good one, you lovely, lovely people.